Hi, Mace. How
Hi,
are you?
Ethan. I'm good.
It
Thank you.
almost feels like seeing you in this space is unmediated compared to all the different versions of you that I've seen in Tashkil recently, all the different elements of yourself and your body. Um, I wanted to start by speaking of the entry point to the show and your work, which kind of revolves around the mouth and this idea of negative spaces. If you could speak a bit more about that here.
For sure. Let me pull out a few visuals. I guess this is the least mediated. A lot of people have seen me in a while. I did a lot of the work that's in the show actually kind of like this. A lot of the conversations, our
Mhm.
first conversation about the work happened this way. Um,
Right.
and yeah, I mean, so I'll go back kind of to the mouth because it's like my interest in that cavity was the beginning of a lot of things that crystallized in the show and that I think continue to come up in my practice. Um, it came from sort of my fascination with the mouth really came from thinking about space around the body and how it affects uh, us almost in like a literal material sense. And so I started to look at um, cavities, like the negative spaces around the body. When I say cavities, I don't just mean like, the inside of the ear or the inside of the nose, but also like the space behind the neck and the spaces between toes, like these kind of spaces that I feel are really sensitive and that um, really affect or really relate them to how we experience the world around us. But then the mouth, of course, I mean, I immediately, when I started this sort of little vein of study, immediately got hooked on the space of the mouth because it's also the space of language. It's where, I mean, it's where we first interact with the world. As babies, we cry or like, and there's this constant. It's where we attempt to communicate. It's also um, our first reaction to trauma or to surprise or sort of our instinctive thing is to make noise through the mouth. um, and it just felt like a really charged space, and what I was interested in is to trace like the pre-language in the body.
Yeah.
I was just really, what I was really excited about is trying to see, okay, this is where we talk, but where does it actually begin?
Yeah.
It
It's
actually,
almost as if you're looking for the occupation of that space before language within voids of the body, so to speak. It's almost as if you're trying to investigate and probe that both visually and in the past more materially, I would say, as you
yeah,
kind of created forms.
yeah, and what's really interesting to me is always kind of like this fleshiness of it. Like I'm really interested in like the fleshiness of this conceptually laden space. When I started to sort of think about the mouth as a charged space, I was reading a lot of Willem Flusser, who's a Czech philosopher, and he has a book called Gestures, and in the book he also talks about well, he doesn't talk about it as much as he posits that, there's the question of what was developed first, language or the apparatus of language in our bodies. Like, did we actually evolve because because we needed to utter, or sort of our vocal kind of box and these mechanisms, did they evolve because we needed to utter, or did we build language because this is the machinery we had for it? And he thinks,
Mhm.
about that through humans, and then about animals and what kind of communication systems they have. But like I was just really interested in like can we mesh together kind of this conceptual and maybe a little bit like it's kind of like full of pathos idea of like where speech begins or where language begins, and
Mhm.
actually find a physical like a locatable pin, like a Google Map
Right.
pin in the body for that. And
Hmm.
in the thing that's playing right now, what I really wanted was to be where a word would be. I was just like,
Hmm.
what does a word see as it's coming out?
Interesting. That's where you really go into the abstract, because you also have other elements of your practice that are much more about legibility and understandability of language, and also drawing from Flusser, where he talks about how do we think before we speak, or do the words speak? And I think that's also a very interesting element that you've integrated in different sections of your practice. But to return to the mouth and this fleshiness that's kind of visceral, but also very much abstract, or, there's an element of it that gets, I guess, tainted by light, which was intentional in the work that you did. And I feel that it kind of exists at the intersection of the gesture of speech, but also the haptic. And so I was wondering if you could take us through the haptic elements of your work as you move through the mouth here as an entry point.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of go back to like the like the I guess the gestural element, and I guess that does tie into the haptic. But what I wanted to try at some point is to actually record a pre-speech. So again, to that, like, look, it like the thing of trying to find pre-speech location, like location pinpoint.
Right.
I did at some point think, can I actually find it and then pause it, like locate it? And
you touch it.
yeah, exactly. Like to me,
Yeah.
this is this, and what, and light is really interesting because I thought, speech itself usually it's sounds, it's vibrations in the air. So is light. So is heat. So and at this sort of really simple didactic level, I was like, okay, so light is just another way that language gets encoded. What are other ways that we can record language, regardless of whether it becomes readable or not? So I was saying like syllables on the inside of my mouth. I was thinking, this is the space that a word in which a word forms, and so if I pause it, if I freeze it, this is the information that a word contains. It's the semantic information is encoded in an object that is indecipherable or sort of inaccessible. And that
right.
that was really interesting to me because that's kind of the antithesis of language, because language operates in a constantly moving system or bunch of systems.
Right.
It relies on the fact that you and I speak the same language, understand the same implicit kind of connotations, or
and the materiality of it is in question. The
yeah,
materiality of language. It's more the impact of language, its resonance in our body that can be felt. But like to actually try and find language and form, that's a completely different, that's another sphere of linguistics in a sense.
And it's interesting because it's a sphere that's almost like resists playing in all these other systems because it's becomes an object and that's it. And it's almost impossible to try and decipher it and it pauses, right? It's sort of frozen. It doesn't play in with those other dynamics of like social interactions and historical context and again, kind of like attached connotations to things. It just sort of, it sits. And at some point I felt that was really interesting. And then I started to move a little bit more away from that. I started to get excited about really more this, which is still a little inaccessible, but it is in movement and it is in constant shift.
And it's blown up in a sense, it's like the eye is faced with another eye, it's really quite dramatic and quite mediated on different levels. And I remember when I first saw it, I was like, how did she do that? Like I couldn't tell where the camera started and where your mouth ended. And I think you kind of reversed space, the inside and the outside. It takes a bit of thinking to kind of understand where it comes from. In a way, I don't feel it's totally obvious because I'm like, where's the camera? Is it outside the mouth or is it inside the mouth looking out? Which it is, right? It's from the inside looking out.
Yeah. yeah, lots of things happened inside the mouth for this vein of
But then this inside and outside takes me to the way in which you installed this work, because there are different drafts of the way you've kind of entered through the mouth and pictured the mouth. And this is what I find so interesting, because it's where you'd least expect in the external environment to see this like fleshy organ of articulation through a screen. And I'm wondering if you could tell us more about that decision and where that came from.
yeah, I was, I was trying to think through a few different things at the same time that the kind of linearly logical part of my brain was struggling with, which is, I was thinking of language. I was thinking of language in the body, but then I was also thinking of place. And it's easy for me to tie placehood with language, dialects and accents, and also, memories and stories. And I think and even like literary genres. And I think that's an easy line to like connecting line to make. And the same can be said, between body and place as well. You experience place through your body. But what I was trying to do, which was really difficult for my brain to like rationally like make an equation of or find like one simple straight line, is put all three together: language, place, and the body. And so I just put them all together, like literally. So,
Yeah, I know you often see things as elements that are then juxtaposed. But what I find interesting from this is that there's so much of your work that deals with being from or of a place. There's a site specificity to the language. There's, you know, um, a great sensitivity to intonation. And yet this is a non-site. Like it's just a random sandpit. There is no signifier other than the mouth and the screen inside it. There's no sense of what it could be. Is it part of a construction site? Is it something that's about to be formed? Which is why I feel placing the mouth there is then gives another kind of textural element to it that is, interesting, because it's where you wouldn't expect it to be. And it is very much the pre-site in a sense of a space and then of language in some ways, I guess, but maybe I'm reading too much into it. But I really do like this element of the non-site that is part of mediation as well, that I feel you tackle really strongly in your work symbolically.
pre-site is really interesting because it makes me think of like pre-word, right? Which is what I say pre-word a lot, like in my studio, because to me that's a location. And so thinking of pre-site is really interesting. What I was focusing on in this piece is just the body, even with like the sandpit. Like it was one of these like initial, not initial, but sort of straightforward attempts at thinking of like almost abstract place and body. And to me, that video is not as abstract. It's a video of a conversation. The conversation was very specific, or a reenactment of a conversation. But its specificity as a video becomes the fact that just like with all the other video pieces here, it's my body, and
Right,
uh,
right.
and it's my body, thinking of my body at distance, and
Mm.
and as in this space specifically as something that is in constantly attempting to bridge this, well, not bridge but cross distances. uh,
Right, the threshold. But at the same time, by trying to locate your body and saying that it fails, or like kind of performing the failure, there's elements there that are about, disembodied body, right? Because then you have a lot of your other work where you're looking, as you said, at the negative spaces, the in between the toes, um, or you have one of the works that I really like is where you have your feet in this doorway that can't be accessed because it's stuck. Like people will want to go in and they'll see this very seductive kind of blue light, but then it's just we can't go in. And there's almost the question for the viewer is, why is it even there? You know what I mean? And I think that's exactly what you're trying to do with those, sections of your feet, not even your calves, but just the feet in the doorway, close. nearby, and in the teleprompter as well. So again, creating another body from a machine in some sense, you know, this
Yeah, I,
hybrid form.
yeah, I the feet were really interesting because while with the mouth, I mean, I've started thinking of the mouth a lot before, a lot longer, um, and a lot earlier than I started thinking of the feet in my practice. But the feet are really interesting because to me it started a little bit more intuitively than uh, with the mouth. It's easy for me to see where it comes in to my practice because I've always been interested in language. Um,
Right.
but with the feet, it was just because at some point I was going out and looking, I was thinking of place, and so I was thinking of land, and I was looking down, and down is where feet are. And so I was thinking of this like uh, the first point of contact with a place is feet. Um, and I guess it's almost like, the first attempt at contact with the world outside is the mouth. It's screaming or it's crying or it's breathing, the first breath. The first point of contact with place is feet. Um,
Right.
and so you can hear like the crinkliness. Um, but
Yeah, I love this work.
I've thought a lot um, about feet visually rather than sort of in this like rational kind of linear way. But what it is um, it's both the thing that is meant to give you the most unmediated touch in place, and at the same time, it never is actually unmediated. You're always wearing shoes, or we're always,
Right.
I don't know how many floors above, or etc. And so this is one of a series of videos that I took kind of going around the city and just touching or attempting to touch different surfaces.
Yeah, and I'm interested in this sense of the artificial boundary that kind of manifests in this work. And in a way, it made me laugh because, in a way, it's so Dubai, you know? It's like there's this sense of greenery underneath stone, or like what could look like petals or whatever is that, but it's actually just a green plastic sheet, in fact. And you kind of experimenting with that kind of boundary and being so close and yet not accessing what's underneath, which I found, again, similar to seeing those feet and not being able to enter. You know, it's like you always leave the viewer at the threshold of entry, even through the mouth, you know, even because how deep can you go, actually? You know, there's this technological probing that takes place in your work, but there's also this barrier that's always there, and it comes through mediation, and it's not always digital. Often it's also material or
Yeah.
technological, you know.
And with that piece inside kind of like the ajar door, the little slit in the wall, I really was thinking of that. I was thinking of um, kind of what it like spaces or places you are completely aware of with your body, but find them inaccessible, or your body has no access. And I had this corner in the gallery room, and I knew I wanted to do something with the light. I knew I wanted to do something with the architecture of the space, and I had multiple different kind of ideas, but that doorway was it was once I was in the space and realized that door is there. Because it's actually, when you close it, it's almost non-existent. But once I realized it's there, I just really needed another hint, more than just that sort of bleeding of light towards the ceiling. I really needed um, just one other thing that's so tantalizingly close, but that still bars you from accessing the space. Um, yeah.
which which basically leads me to the question, what does it feel like for you for the ground not to entirely hold you? or the sense that you don't recognize your own image. Because what I'm getting from the feet is a very kind of strange familiarity, but also this uncanny sense of estrangedness, which, you know, if that existed as a term. But this idea of stepping outside of yourself for a day and wondering what it would be like to be you, you know?
Yeah. It that that's a thing. That's an experience that comes a lot when I'm, or that sort of started that series of videos with the feet, um, where you think of like you start to really feel like you're outside of your own skin, um,
Hmm.
and sometimes it feels like um, it's a little different depending on where I am. Almost literally, like where I am in the world, and for a while, it really felt like a lack of substance, or like lacking
Hmm.
substance in a sense. I did spend a lot of time thinking about my image projections, um, and what sort of alters my image, um, or how does my image alter things, and
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the term stateless, um, again in this sort of really funny almost didactic sense, where it's like, what do you mean stateless? Nothing in the world is stateless. We have three states. It's
Right.
solid, liquid, or gas, and nothing is stateless.
Right.
um,
Mm.
and and then I think, in this like old school old science things, like, oh, but there's light, and light is none of these three things. And
Right.
sometimes that's what it feels like. It feels like you know you are, it feels like I am a projection of myself and not just myself. um
Right. And that's where I feel like this foreign gaze is cast onto the viewer, and then the viewer has to kind of develop it as well or understand it from a perspective that's yours, but that's outside yourself. And there's so much experimentation involved. And sometimes, I mean, as much as some of the subjects you deal with are, you know, serious subjects related to citizenship and statelessness, as you were saying, but also disembodiment and being disenfranchised and, you know, very real kind of conditions, as much as there's a playful, I would say, experimentation. So I was wondering if you could tell us like an inside joke here.
yeah. I'll show you an insight.
Even better.
This is my favorite part
Oh.
of recording one of the videos that made it into the show, which is like, I will not break character at all. um,
Your face doesn't change, your face doesn't move.
um, but I mean, the it's all a little funny because it's also the only way I can think through these things, and sort of just completely accepting the absurdity, or embracing their absurdity, um,
Right,
their
right.
ridiculousness. Um,
I wouldn't even say that it's comic relief. I would say it's another language that runs through your work as a thread. You know, the absurdity, the surreal element of like certain things we say or certain facts of life. You know, I would say that's almost one of your languages amongst the many, because here you created this, I mean, I guess you could say manifesto or bayan or announcement of a new form of digital citizenship, but announced by like a spokesperson. So in a very, you know, official way. But then in other elements of your work, you have a lot of poetry and prose, but you also have like this didacticism that you were talking about, like the dictionary definitions. I almost feel you don't really discriminate. Like you understand the richness of language, but you're not taking sides in a way. You have them separately and in the same space to kind of create the substance that you're talking about, create this matter that's hard to define in a way. But correct me if I'm wrong. It is interesting that you don't you distinguish between them, but you don't necessarily take sides when it
yeah.
comes to language.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you mean kind of almost formally, correct? Like
Yes.
forms of language, whether it's like, official or state
Yes.
speak type of language,
Yes.
or
Like
sort
the rules that govern language, you're very good to abide by them, but also question them within. So it's almost a deconstructionist approach, but that doesn't take sides, doesn't say this is my preference and this is the language that I'm going to use. You have all of them at your disposal in some ways.
yeah, and it's because I say this a lot when like people ask me like why do you do art, or when I ask myself why do I do art, and it's because it's sort of it's driven by curiosity, and I've I enjoy thinking about language and all these sort of different kind of ways it can operate, and that includes kind of how we actually use it, um, sometimes insidiously, I mean very often actually insidiously, but how it is
Yeah.
used almost, um, uh, at a nation state level, or at a uh, mass power dynamic affect level, but also
Yeah.
how how it actually came to be, how it actually came to be able to perform in that way. And so even it's sort of
Right.
historical, like the context around which we build like linguistic traditions in different, I mean,
Yeah.
for me my interest is specifically in the Arabic linguistic tradition. And so that's also really, really exciting to me. But all of it really comes from, first and foremost, being interested in poetry, and in kind of language as a tool of expression or artistic expression almost.
As a side note, I literally just watched a film last night. It's a 15-minute film. It's by John Smith. It's called Citadel, and it just takes the public announcements of Boris Johnson against the facade of certain elements of London. You need to watch it. And also looks inside people's homes, and just you can see the radical, just incomprehensibility of these announcements surrounding the coronavirus and how they changed from month to month and all the contradictions inherent. And also the filmmaker was just, gave us a very flat cityscape, but that kept changing during the day with the light. And also manipulated the sound a little bit to make it like warped or echo, or just to kind of designate, but there's no spokesperson like in yours, but it kind of highlighted that absurdity that you're talking about. And experiencing such an extreme situation as the world is now, it's interesting to go back to rhetoric and to go back to state speak and to look at what's happening there and how, I mean, it doesn't make sense, and how brilliant George Orwell was with 1984, like all these things. There's definitely a history to them, but they get magnified in situations like the right of return, like this problem with citizenship, which and refugees, and when are you granted asylum, and what is it that you need to kind of say in order to be admitted. And I think Hiwa K also deals with this in Jamil Art
Mm.
Center in a remarkable work. So I think, but what is interesting about going back to your work about this performance is I can't recognize you in some ways. And that goes back to the saying is that you have all these selves that are performed through different languages that become different, different projections of you. And this devotional element of the state speak that you announce with such certainty, and for its economic rationality and other things as well, is what really impressed me, because it does come from the Arabic. There is something very Arabic in it, like there's something that you can tie to the ways in which I guess you say officialdom has been projected, but also there's something very mediated and new about it. So there's something there's a retro futuristic element to it that interests me. And actually, I don't think I've asked you this before, but I was wondering what the link was with Star Wars and other kind of elements that people can glean through this, the backdrop.
Should we play the video and then dive into it a little
Oh,
more?
sure.
Talk about
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
rituals.
Sure.
Okay. Um, I have to just share sound.
ونعيد ونكرر أننا هنا وفي ظل شجر ونخل وفد قبلنا ندعو جميع الوفود المقيمة للاطمئنان ونؤكد للبقية دوام الامتنان ونطمئنهم بأننا اليوم جميعا هنا وفدنا لنقيم هنا وسنعمل معا من هنا.
So this piece was done in collaboration with Mariam Dabbagh, who is a writer, and it was written originally in Arabic. And you know, we were thinking about terms we use to define kind of political subjects in Arabic and their relationship to place. And you know, and this kind of comes through in the other work in the show, but I was really interested in two specific terms in Arabic, wafid and muqim, and sort of the main difference, the demographic they have described at different periods overlaps. It's not completely the same, but it overlaps. And the main difference between them is that one literally means to flow into, so to immigrate, and the other is to reside, so a resident. And so we were really, I was really intrigued by these two terms, and I kind of like tried to unpack them in some of the other work. But what Mariam and I talked about was, you know, what would it be like if we wanted to, we were trying to think about why did the terms shift? Why did we move from calling certain people wafdin or expatriates to muqimin or residents? And you know, I don't know, but we thought, you know, what would it be like if we sort of playfully took this idea of moving into or sort of becoming part of a nation state by like being present in it, if that nation state was digital. So and the, you know, and the whole kind of like the digital as nation state or a sort of like fabulated digital nation state came from thinking a lot about telepresence and about kind of the digital being almost proof of us, of our ability to be in multiple places at once, regardless of where the body is. And Mariam and I decided to just sort of run with that, like far. And we were like, okay, what would you tell a newly arrived like immigrant, resident, expatriate, whatever, into this like nation state, and you know, arrived almost like with their body. What would that bureaucratic official language that tries to describe or delineate a boundary of like that person's relationship to place, what would it sound like?
What would it look like as well?
What would it look like? So
yeah.
I mean, and you were asking about kind of like Star Wars imagery, or rather, it's this came a little bit also from Mariam's research, who was really interested in kind of 80s and 90s Arab regime manifestos and their forms, and quite often when these manifestos or statements and bayanat were read, they actually have the text rising up really slowly in front of kind of the reader, who is always, or often at least, sort of a man.
A man.
Yeah, the official speaker of the state, or the you know, the person delivering. Yeah. And so I was just thinking of like the affect, or sort of, and again, and almost in a fun, you know, it's a little ridiculous, but I mean, it's both ridiculous and it's not, because it has also like very real consequences. Um, but I was thinking again of that idea of like light that transforms, that insubstantial substance that transforms at surface level, but it is quite transformative, even if
Right.
it does not touch the physical essence. Um, and of course, with sort of like very different, at a variable level, recognizable kind of state iconography, um, along with this.
I mean, it becomes almost like a transparent palimpsest. Like, I don't think I could say it's a palimpsest because everything is projected and on top of something, not materially, digitally. So, but it gives that layered element of it, where it's also difficult to recognize you because you really perform that part, and the language is just so, in a way, bizarre, but it's also something people can understand and relate to, and it's familiar. I mean, there's a familiar element of it if you look at places like Iraq and Syria and other regimes that kind of develop this whole idea around a certain pan-Arabism, I would even say, in the past. Like, there is that element of extreme nationalism with extreme non-nationalism, in a way, because it's saying, let's just create this world where everyone can prosper. It sounds so like, yeah, why didn't we think of that, kind of thing.
But it's really interesting because that work in the space, I mean, it's really exciting to me because that work in the space is bracketed by two pieces that kind of.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about how would you compare it to the other works?
Yeah.
Where you're looking at the definitions or like the ideas behind expat and resident a bit more kind of critically.
Yeah, but what this does is, and we'll look at the two other pieces now, but what this does is it takes these two terms and puts them together, sometimes in a way that like contradicts itself, and otherwise that in a way that feels like a really weird assemblage of both terms. But also in other times it really plays on all the different derivations of the root of these words. And so I'll move to these other works, and before I play them, so it in the space that performance is bracketed by these two figures, kind of trying to unpack the derivations of the roots of each term. I'll start with the qama.
قام على قدم وساق قاموا قومة رجل واحد لم تقم له قائمة بعد لم تقم له قائمة بعد لا تقوم للأعداء قائمة قامت قيامته.
And so that's just a small section of a much longer, I think maybe 6 pages of the dictionary goes into the different derivations of the root of the word resident.
وفد يفد وفود وفاد على إلى على إلى على إلى على.
And these pieces were, I really was thinking of language very differently than in the piece that is in the space in the middle between them, because I really was thinking of almost language as a an additive sculpture in a sense. I was thinking of how we have a three-lettered root in Arabic, and then from that three-lettered root, we start to build. You add letters, you shuffle some things, you add prefixes and suffixes, but they're all, and there are two different ways to do that, and some are, a non-augmented derivation does not add any semantic meaning, but the word for resident actually goes through a different process of derivation, which is augmented derivation. So there is actually a layering of semantic information that happens between the root and arriving at the word resident that to me feels like additive sculpture, really, like you're adding things onto something. And it's always in a way that you're able to trace it back to its root. And so I was really interested in the form of language here, in the way that it sort of becomes a little malleable or sculptural with intention, or with like intention.
Which almost manifests in the final form of the work, where you use this 3D camera to kind of render yourself in a very globular, I don't know how you would describe that. I mean, this is the idea, this is my idea of what a cyborg would look like, but it's kind of more, I don't know, like it seems more fluid in some ways visually than maybe the notion of a cyborg.
Because it's so it's shot with depth measuring camera, which uses both light and laser, and they're pretty ubiquitous these days. They're in people's phones, but essentially it's a 3D scanner, and so what you're seeing is actually a rendering of measurements, a rendering of distances from the camera, and the renderer, the program is constantly recalculating, and there's a margin of error constantly. So it's like it's completely in this like realm of the digital, which has no dimension, but yet is measuring dimensions. And so it's constantly shifting, it's constantly recalculating, and it's constantly like it's in constant flux. And it's I mean, what attracts me to this, which I think even the visual language of this, these colors that measure distance are going to be, or are already kind of becoming a lot more recognizable as so depth measuring visualization. What really excites me about this is it is both kind of not cyborgy, but very digital. We know that
it's very digital, yeah.
We know that this is
no, I mean, cyborg is almost like it's almost an inaccuracy to say that, but there's this element that you could be one.
Because it's a very mathematical thing,
right?
It is definitely very kind of, it's too rational to be fleshy, but it is fleshy in the same. I mean, this is
very fleshy.
That excites me. At some point you see that there is a depth in the mouth when it's opening, and at others it just is completely flat.
Yeah. And this kind of leads me to my next question. Speaking of all these, like here we're talking about language that you reenact or perform based on a collaboration, let's say with Mariam Dabbar, that's research driven, or here where you're literally reading down dictionary derivations. But you also have a lot of creative forms of writing that have entered your work recently. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about, or if you can pinpoint that moment when you realize that your own writing, because I know that you're a lover of language and literature and you've been drawing from other sources as well as creating your own, but when did your own writing, when did you decide that your own writing would be part of your art? Because I know you also write and that's like a part of your practice, but not in this way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I thought of my writing as a practice before I started thinking of my visual art as a practice.
Okay.
But yeah, I never brought them together as much as I started to do more recently, in the last couple of years. But before I was able to do that, I had to put someone else's writing in my work. And so there was a moment a few years ago where I knew I needed my interest in language to be a bit more specific in my work. And I started by thinking about, literature broadly, but also thinking about literary genres. Okay, I'll just let this play. So I started by thinking about the literary genres as types of books. Exiled literature versus literature from within places. Palestinian resistance literature is literally defined as um, poetry or production from the place.
لم تبكني مسحت دمعها علها عندما عانقتني.
Okay, I think that was just a quick thing.
And this was a non-Arabic audience, right? Because you had translation there.
This was mostly a non-Arabic audience. And I remember, and I spoke about this piece before, but almost everyone that didn't speak Arabic kind of completely neglected the reading the translation. I mean, I did make it hard. I was thinking of accessibility and legibility, and that's, the space in which translation sits, and we often neglect. And that was when actually it was that vein of work that got me to first start to put my own words into my art pieces, thinking about,
but
again,
still with an obscurity element, which is very different from what you're doing now. Yeah,
I definitely, and I was in a very different place in my practice, and I also was in a very different place, like geographically. I did these while I was at grad school in the US, and it's very frustrating trying to talk about something that is not contextual. I was just thinking about Arabic language. I was thinking about Arabic poetry, and it was, this came from trying to figure out what is something that I'm interested in that I can actually have meaningful conversation with those who are around me on. And it was translation. I was really thinking about translation in like a much broader sense. So this is the first time I put my words out of the page, basically. I had these little vignettes that were very much about placehood, but I felt really nervous about putting them out there. And so, almost this like mediation of readability, kind of making it hard to read was one way to be like, just take a second before you take my words completely at face value. But I'm somewhere very different now, and I've learned to give my own words credit. And I write cumulatively. I'm constantly kind of building up notes and little like vignettes and small pieces of prose, and one of the pieces in the show, I don't know if I should be quiet when we're playing it. Maybe I'll pause.
Yeah, here we're talking more about aggregation of text, right? That you had worked over a long period of time. Did you see it as being one form, or was it something that you were working on continuously that was like fragmented? I mean, it doesn't read it as fragmented at all, but I know this about your process, and I know this is one of the works that you had been really working on for a while in terms of writing it.
Yeah, I don't know if I had a very clear intention for any of the writing that I did over the past year, rather than I just knew that it will go somewhere at some point. And so I have countless, files and notes with very different voices almost. And what happened, I come to a point where, okay, I have spent a year thinking about these three things. And in thinking about these three things, I've accumulated all this material. And then and it's not exactly stitching, and it's rather kind of massaging things in together. And there will be, and they're, and I don't work in one language and then go back to the other. They're kind of, it, it's a lot more, it's a lot closer to code switching in speech, because I'll have a line, and because I write them for myself in that initial stage, in that accumulative process, and then they come, and then I'll think about visuals that I've also accumulated, because also even the visual part of the videos are cumulative in that sense. There's things I was interested in, I was thinking about, and so I'll collect these like little material studies in one way, or video notes, and then I've got, and it's a lot. It's not a very linear process of putting them together. It's not a linear process of writing them, and it's also not. It's just I've got these files together, and it's a little bit like a very messy desk, except it's on my screen, and then it's playing kind of matchmaker between things. And then
it definitely reads as polyvocal, and I would say that writing is never linear, but obviously writing to be published in a certain form is very different from writing a poem, where you're kind of breaking all the rules, and that's, you know, that's the essence of the work in some ways. But here I would say there are a lot of different voices, as you said, which is actually the mark of a true poet in some ways. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot in terms of the textural elements and the colors, but also the voices that you have in there, which sometimes are computer voices, you know, which kind of leads me to this idea of color and how your color is coded based on the digital sphere in so many ways. Yeah. What is it about the blue?
Yeah, I've gotten that question a lot during the show, because you enter the space and this is what the space looks like. It's very, very blue. And with like little hints of magenta. And and even though I also have, you know, once you're in the other spaces, there's also a lot of green, but the question is always why blue? And my answer is always that my interest in color actually first started with green. And I can trace that back to a piece I did in 2019. So now, yes, 2019, where I was still in the US, and I was a lot frustrated. Again,
a lot.
I was a lot frustrated with, you know, I had things I wanted to think about, but it wasn't the right time or place for me to think about them. And I remember thinking, you know, okay, I have to put up this show. It's a group show with fantastic artists and friends, but I had to put up this show and I had to put it in this place. And honestly, whatever I put in here could be anywhere. Like, why is it in this space? And I thought, okay, so then let it be anywhere. And so I thought, you know, I'm going to green screen whatever I can in the gallery. And so I was thinking of like the chroma key green as this, you know, alternative to anywhere else. And part of me was thinking of, that's fine, I'll take a photo and then I'll just pretend this is wherever I need it to be. Do I need this to be, you know, in the UAE? Do I need this to be in Palestine? Do I need it to be in Syria? It doesn't matter. I'll just like green screen it in. And again, you know.
And what did you redact there with the chroma green?
Yeah, so I had these forms for applying for passports. So I was thinking about almost angrily, to be honest, but I was thinking about these well, the bureaucracies that we have around relationship to place again, and
belonging,
and yeah, and the arbitrariness of it. And so in here, so I pulled out as many kind of passport application forms as I could online, and then I redacted any mention of nation state, any mention of place in all, with green screen. So it's like, this is how you apply to be anywhere.
Anywhere, yeah.
Yeah, but blue was also something I was interested in for a very long time, and it comes in through a lot of different things, and it comes in through different pieces, not just sort of that light spillage that's happening in the space, because it's also in, at some point my use of it became really intuitive. It's in the sky, which and it's in water, which both feel like the opposite of land in a sense, or the alternative to land when we're thinking of land as the sort of really um, uh, important aspect of place and belonging. And so at some point, it's almost the freedom of all the um, uh, problems of land, even though that's not entirely true. But there's that association to me with blue. But there's also, it's the color on my passport cover. And then it's the color of vision, like all these little tests that I would do with projection, thinking about states of being or about substance, always start with my projector telling me that there's no signal. And so at some point I was thinking of blue as disconnection blue, while green was the anywhere green. But I think I think a better way of putting it is if green actually really stands for the possibility, or it sort of promises the possibility of anywhere. I think blue, in this sort of very digital sense it gives us, blue is the promise of infinity. I think.
Yeah. It's well put. It's, in a way, it's very daunting to look at this blue. And then you have these instructional help codes, or like different texts that provide no relief whatsoever. So I guess my last question then would be is, if the mouth is the way to enter your work at the moment, what is the exit for you? Like, where do you leave? How do you leave? with a flurry of projections. This was from How to Be a Human, right?
Yeah, this was from a work that I was playing a lot with this idea of projection and of sort of transforming space through light, through insubstance or immateriality. And it sort of dug into recipes for making a human being by a medieval Muslim scientist. But what is the exit? I don't know.
I think it's fair. I think that's fair. But it's interesting because you've definitely kind of distilled language to, as you said, like through this lens of formalism in some ways, in terms of how you orate and how you articulate the actual words. But at the same time, you're not dealing with legibility in the same way that you did in the past. Like, it really is looking at the roots of words. It's really semantically strong. And then you also have a lot of other kind of flows, creative flows coming in that are, accumulated over time. So I'm really curious to see where and how language and speech acts are going to move you next.
Yeah, I'm curious too.
We can only watch and wait, right?
Yeah, me too. Just let eyes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for contextualizing your work. And yeah, I'll see you in real life or on the screen.
Hope so.
Or both.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I really appreciate the
You're most welcome. It was a pleasure.